April 14th, 1945, Frisoith, Germany. The small town sat in ruins, smoke still rising from broken buildings, as Canadian soldiers of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders moved through the rubble-filled streets. These men had been fighting for 10 months straight since D-Day. They had watched 465 of their brothers fall. They were exhausted. They were angry, and now their commander was dead. Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Griffiths lay in the street where he had fallen just hours before. A German sniper's bullet had found him as he walked through what everyone thought was a secured town. The men who served under him stood around his body in silence. Some were crying, most just stared with empty eyes that had seen too much death. They had trusted Griffiths. He had led them through France, through Belgium, and now into the heart of Germany itself. And in one single moment, he was gone. The SS Guards who had been captured earlier that day now sat in groups around the town square. There were about 50 of them. Some were young, barely old enough to shave. Others were hardened veterans who wore their black uniforms with pride even in defeat. They showed no fear. They showed no remorse. Some even smiled at the Canadian soldiers guarding them. This was the problem the Allies had been facing for weeks now. The SS did not surrender like normal soldiers. They fought to the death. They set traps. They killed medics and prisoners. They followed no rules. For months, British commanders back in comfortable headquarters had told the frontline troops that the Geneva Convention would protect everyone. They said that as long as soldiers followed the rules of war, everything would work out fairly. They said that German soldiers would surrender when they knew the war was lost. But the men of the Argyll Regiment knew better. They had seen what the SS did to prisoners. They had found Canadian soldiers tied to trees and shot. They had discovered bodies that had been mutilated beyond recognition. The Geneva Convention meant nothing to the SS. It was just words on paper written by people who had never seen real combat. The military police officers who served behind the lines believed that regular army discipline would keep soldiers in check. They thought that the threat of court-martial would prevent troops from breaking the rules. They had charts and regulations and procedures for everything. But they had never spent 10 months in continuous combat. They had never watched their friends die day after day. They had never felt the kind of rage that builds up inside a man when he sees too much senseless killing. As darkness fell over Frisoith that April evening, something inside the Canadian soldiers snapped. Officers who would later give testimony said they could feel it in the air. The men were talking in low voices. They were checking their weapons. They were looking at the SS prisoners with eyes that promised violence. Some sergeants tried to calm things down, but their words fell on deaf ears. One soldier who survived the war would later say that it felt like a dam breaking. All the anger, all the pain, all the loss of 10 months came flooding out at once. Major General Chris Vokes sat in his command post 20 miles away from Frisoith. He was the commander of the 2nd Canadian Corps, part of the highest levels of Canadian high command in Europe. At 41 years old, he had spent most of his military career in peacetime, doing paperwork and training exercises. Nobody expected him to become the kind of general who would face impossible choices. But the Italian campaign had changed him. He had watched thousands of young Canadians die in the mountains and mud of Italy. He had learned that war was not like the textbooks described. War was chaos and blood, and decisions that had no right answers. When the first reports from Frisoith reached Vokes's desk the next morning, he read them 3 times. His aide said the general's face went pale. The report said that Canadian soldiers had taken the SS prisoners away in small groups. They said shots had been heard throughout the night. They said that approximately 50 German soldiers were now dead, executed without trial. and they said that the town of Frisoith itself had been systematically burned to the ground. 89% of the buildings were now smoking ruins. Vaux knew what this meant. Under military law, this was murder. Under the Geneva Convention, this was a war crime. His soldiers, good men who had fought bravely for their country, could be hanged for what they had done. But as he read the reports more carefully, he began to notice something that the military lawyers and the British commanders and the people back home would never understand. These men had been pushed past the breaking point. They had been asked to do the impossible for 10 straight months. They had faced an enemy that showed no mercy and followed no rules. And when their beloved commander died in what should have been a safe area, something inside them broke. Vaux put down the reports and looked out the window of his command post. He could see young soldiers walking by, their uniforms dirty, their faces showing the strain of constant combat. Some of them were only 19 years old. They had left farms and factories and schools in Canada to fight for freedom. Now they were being asked to show mercy to an enemy that had shown them none. How could he punish them for being human? How could he sacrifice them on the altar of rules that the enemy ignored? But how could he let murder go unpunished? This was the question that would define his legacy. This was the moment when Chris Vaux realized that sometimes being a good commander meant protecting your men from the consequences of what war had turned them into. General Vaux could not sleep that night. He sat alone in his command post, reading the reports over and over by lamplight. Each page revealed something that made his chest tighten. The military police had been thorough, too thorough. They had names, they had photographs, they had witnesses who could identify which Canadian soldier did what. This was not going to disappear quietly. But what struck Vaux most was not the evidence of killing. It was what he found between the lines of the official reports. A sergeant had written that he saw men weeping as they pulled their triggers. Another report mentioned a private who vomited after the executions and then sat in silence for 3 hours. A medical officer noted that many of the soldiers involved showed signs of complete emotional breakdown. These were not cold-blooded killers. These were shattered men who had finally reached their limit. Vaux thought about his own journey through this war. He had started as a peacetime officer who believed in rules and order. The Italian campaign had beaten that out of him. He remembered a day in the mountains when his men found 3 Canadian prisoners who had been tortured to death by German soldiers. The bodies had been mutilated so badly that they could barely be identified. Vaux had watched his soldiers weep with rage. He had felt that same rage himself, and he had done nothing to stop what his men did to the next group of German prisoners they captured. He had simply walked away and let it happen. How could he now judge the men of Frisoith when he carried his own guilt? The reports also contained something the lawyers would never understand. Interviews with German civilians revealed that Lieutenant Colonel Griffiths had been killed after the town had officially surrendered. The white flags were already flying. The fighting was supposed to be over. But some SS fanatic hiding in an attic had decided to take one more shot. That was what broke the Canadian soldiers. It was not just that their commander died. It was that he died after they thought they were finally safe. After 10 months of constant danger, they had let their guard down for one moment, and in that moment, they lost the man who had kept them alive. Vaux made notes in the margins of the reports. He was building his argument. These men had been betrayed by an enemy that refused to follow any rules. They had been pushed beyond what any human should endure. They had watched their commander die in what should have been a moment of victory. Yes, what they did was wrong. Yes, it violated military law. But prosecuting them would be punishing men for being human in the most inhuman situation imaginable. What troubled Vokes even more was what happened after the executions. Someone had ordered the town burned. The reports were vague about who gave that command. Some soldiers said it came from an officer. Others insisted it was a spontaneous decision by men who were beyond thinking clearly. Vokes suspected the truth was that no single person gave the order. It had simply happened because the rage had nowhere else to go. When you push men past their breaking point, they do not think about consequences. They just act. The reports reached General Vokes's command post in a steady stream. Each new piece of information made the situation worse. The military police had collected statements from 47 Canadian soldiers who had witnessed at least part of what happened. Some of the witnesses admitted to taking part in the executions. Others said they had tried to stop it, but were pushed aside by men who were beyond listening to reason. A few said they simply walked away because they could not bear to watch. Standard military protocol was crystal clear. When soldiers commit murder, they face court-martial. It did not matter if they were tired. It did not matter if they were angry. The law was the law. Military justice existed to keep armies from becoming mobs. Without discipline, without rules, an army was just a gang of armed men doing whatever they wanted. The judge advocate. General's office began preparing the paperwork for what would be one of the largest court-martial proceedings in Canadian military history. But General Vokes saw something in the report that the lawyers missed. He pulled out the service records of the men involved. What he saw confirmed what he already suspected. These were not troublemakers or criminals. They were decorated soldiers with exemplary records, men who had earned medals for bravery, men who had saved their comrades under fire, men who had done everything their country asked of them. And now they faced the death penalty for one moment when the weight of it all became too much to bear. The statistics painted a devastating picture. Nearly half the men who had landed in France were now dead or wounded. The survivors had seen friends blown apart by artillery. They had watched medics die trying to save the wounded. They had found the bodies of prisoners who had been tortured and killed by the SS. And through it all, they had been told to follow the rules, to treat prisoners fairly, to be better than their enemy. Vokes knew that no Allied soldiers had ever been prosecuted for killing SS guards. The Americans had faced a similar situation at Dachau concentration camp just days before Frisoith. When American soldiers liberated Dachau and saw the mountains of corpses and the walking skeletons of prisoners, some of them had executed the SS guards they captured. The army had investigated, but no one was ever charged. The British had dealt with similar incidents by quietly moving units away from the front lines and letting the matter drop. Only the Canadians seemed determined to hold their soldiers accountable. General Vokes made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He ordered a formal investigation to continue. The military police would gather all the evidence and take all the statements. Everything would be documented properly. But at the same time, he wrote a recommendation that no charges should be filed. His reasoning was simple and devastating. These men have fought savagely and seen their comrades killed by an enemy that respects no rules. To prosecute them now would be to punish them for being human in an inhuman situation. Vokes did something else that surprised everyone. He personally drove to where the Argyll Regiment was resting behind the lines. He gathered the officers and senior sergeants and spoke to them directly. He did not yell. He did not threaten. He simply acknowledged what had happened. He told them that he understood their rage and their pain. He said that Lieutenant Colonel Griffiths had been a fine officer and a good man. But he also made it clear that what happened in Frisoith could never happen again. The war was almost over. Germany was collapsing. There would be no more towns burned. There would be no more prisoners executed. Then Vaux did something that showed he truly understood his men. He ordered the entire regiment pulled out of frontline combat within 72 hours. They had earned a rest. They had given everything they had to give. Other units would finish the job of defeating Germany. The men of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders had fought their last battle. Many of the soldiers wept when they heard the news, some from relief, some from guilt, some simply because they were too exhausted to feel anything else. The investigation files would eventually grow to 847 pages, but General Vaux had already made his choice. He would protect his men, even if it meant putting his own career at risk. Hey, quick pause here. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like these deserve to be heard, and look where we're at now, dreaming of 100,000 subscribers. Help me show her that these videos matter. Please subscribe to my channel Canadians at War, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. The official investigation found evidence that at least 20 SS Guards had been executed by Canadian soldiers in Frisoythe. But the investigators believed the real number was much higher. Witnesses spoke of groups of 5 or 6 prisoners being marched away at a time. They heard gunfire from different parts of the town throughout the evening. When they counted the German bodies the next morning, they found approximately 50 dead men who had not died in combat. Some had their hands still bound with wire. Others had been shot in the back of the head at close range. The evidence was clear and damning. This was not the fog of war. This was deliberate killing. Vaux knew that no Allied soldiers had ever been prosecuted for killing SS Guards. The Americans had faced a similar situation at Dachau concentration camp just days before Frisoythe. When American soldiers liberated Dachau and saw the mountains of corpses and the walking skeletons of prisoners, some of them had executed the SS. Guards they captured. The army had investigated, but no one was ever charged. The British had dealt with similar incidents by quietly moving units away from the front lines and letting the matter drop. General H.D.G. Crerar, who commanded the entire 1st Canadian Army, faced enormous pressure from Allied Supreme Command. They wanted to know what he was going to do about the stain on the Allied record. The ruins of Frisoythe told their own terrible story. The blackened remains of buildings stood like broken teeth against the gray German sky. Smoke continued to rise from the wreckage for 3 full days after the fires were set. German civilians who had survived by hiding in cellars emerged to find their entire world destroyed. The church bells had melted into pools of slag from the intense heat. Cobblestone streets had cracked and buckled where buildings collapsed onto them. The acrid smell of burning wood mixed with the sharp chemical stink of cordite from all the ammunition that had been expended. It smelled like the end of the world. Canadian soldiers who had not taken part in the executions moved through this landscape like ghosts. Their faces were blackened with soot and exhaustion. Their eyes had that hollow look that comes from witnessing too much death. Some of them would later say that Frisoythe felt cursed, like the town itself was punishing them for what they had done. They could not sleep there. Every shadow seemed to hide an accusing face. Every sound of settling rubble sounded like footsteps of the dead. British High Command was outraged when they learned the full details of what happened. They sent official letters demanding accountability. How could the Canadians claim to be fighting for civilization and justice while their soldiers burned towns and executed prisoners? The British had maintained strict discipline throughout the war. Yes, there had been incidents, but those incidents had been dealt with properly. Soldiers who broke the rules faced consequences. That was what separated professional armies from barbarians. The Canadian Judge Advocate General's office worked around the clock preparing documents for the court-martial. They had statements from witnesses. They had photographs of the bodies. They had evidence of the fires being deliberately set. Under military law, the case was simple. Murder was murder, even in wartime. The men who pulled the triggers would face the death penalty. The officers who failed to stop it would be dismissed from service in disgrace. Justice would be served no matter how painful it might be. But General Vaux stood firm in his recommendation that no charges be filed. He wrote a statement that would later be found in the classified files. The words were powerful and troubling at the same time. If I was to try these men, I would first have to try myself. We have asked the impossible of these soldiers. They have seen things no human should see, fought an enemy that mutilates prisoners, and watched their friends die by the hundreds. I will not sacrifice them on the altar of legal principle. His words sparked fierce debate at the highest levels of command. Some generals agreed with him completely. These men had given everything for their country. They had endured conditions that would break most people. Punishing them for one moment of lost control seemed cruel and unjust. Other officers argued just as passionately that without accountability, armies became death squads. If these men were not punished, what message did that send? That soldiers could kill anyone they wanted as long as they were tired and angry. The consequences of what happened in Frisoithe spread in unexpected ways. In the week after the incident, 23 soldiers from the Argyll Regiment were hospitalized for what doctors called battle exhaustion. Today, we would call it post-traumatic stress disorder. These men could not eat. They could not sleep. Some of them shook uncontrollably. Others simply stared at walls and said nothing. The killing had broken something inside them that might never be fixed. They had crossed a line that soldiers are never supposed to cross, and now they had to live with what they had done. Other Canadian units became much more cautious about how they engaged SS troops. Word spread quickly through the ranks about what had happened and about the investigation. Soldiers worried that if they made a mistake in the heat of combat, they might face murder charges. Some units started taking fewer prisoners. Others became almost paralyzed by indecision, afraid to act for fear of consequences. The very discipline that the court-martial was supposed to protect was being damaged by the threat of prosecution. Meanwhile, something strange was happening in the German towns that the Canadians approached after Frisoithe. German civilians surrendered more quickly. White flags appeared in windows before the Canadians even arrived. Town mayors came out to meet the advancing troops and begged them to accept peaceful surrender. The story of Frisoithe had spread through the German population like wildfire. They were terrified that if they resisted, their towns would burn too. The Canadians had accidentally discovered that terror could be more effective than bullets. But this realization brought no comfort to anyone. The investigation files grew thicker day by day. Military police collected 142 witness statements, each one adding another layer to the terrible story. Every piece of paper was marked classified. The Canadian government decided that this story should never become public. It would damage morale at home. It would give ammunition to German propaganda. It would tarnish the reputation of Canadian forces who had fought so bravely throughout the war. So the files were sealed and locked away in a vault where they would remain hidden for 40 years. General Crerar faced the hardest decision of his career. He could overrule Vaux and order the court-martial to proceed. Military law supported this choice. International law supported it. But he would be destroying dozens of good soldiers who had already given everything they had. Or he could accept Vaux's recommendation and let the matter drop. This would protect his men, but would set a dangerous precedent that some crimes were too politically inconvenient to prosecute. In the end, Crerar made his choice. The official recommendation came down from the highest levels of Canadian military command. No further action warranted. The men of Friesoythe would not face trial. Justice would be sacrificed for mercy, or perhaps mercy would be sacrificed for practicality. No one could quite agree on which it was. The files about Friesoythe remain locked in Canadian military archives under the highest level of secrecy. For 40 years, almost no one outside of a small circle of officers and government officials knew what had really happened in that German town in April of 1945. The soldiers who were there knew, of course. They carried the memories with them every day. But they never spoke about it, not even to their families. Some took the secret to their graves. Others would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, seeing the faces of the men they had killed. Their wives and children knew something terrible had happened during the war, but they never learned the details. The seal of secrecy finally broke in 1985, 40 years after the war ended. The Canadian government decided that enough time had passed. The men involved were now old if they were still alive at all. The political situation had changed completely. Germany was now a trusted ally. There seemed to be less risk in letting historians see what had happened. When the files were opened, newspapers around the world ran stories about the Friesoythe massacre. Some called it a war crime that had been covered up. Others said it was an understandable reaction to the horrors of war. The debate that General Vaux had tried to avoid 4 decades earlier finally happened in public. The veterans of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders found themselves at the center of unwanted attention. Reporters called their homes asking for interviews. Historians wanted to know exactly what they had seen and done. Most of the veterans refused to talk. A few gave carefully worded statements that said nothing of substance. One veteran told a reporter that some things should stay buried, because digging them up helps no one. Another said that people who were not there could never understand what it felt like to lose a commander you loved to an enemy that followed no rules. A third simply hung up the phone whenever anyone mentioned Friesoythe. General Chris Vaux died in 1985, the same year the files were made public. He was 81 years old. Some people said the timing was suspicious, that maybe he had held on long, enough to see the secret revealed before he passed. Others thought it was just coincidence. Either way, Vaux never had to face the public judgment of his decision. He had written his memoirs years earlier, and they were published just before his death. The book contained only brief, vague references to difficult decisions made in the final days of the war. He never directly discussed Friesoythe. Friends said he had made peace with his choice long ago, but that did not mean he wanted to relive it. History remembered Vaux as a soldier's general, a commander who put the welfare of his men above everything else. He had never been formally reprimanded for his recommendation that no charges be filed. His superiors had agreed with his reasoning, even if they did so quietly. Vaux retired from the military in 1946 with full honors and a chest full of medals. He spent his later years writing and speaking about military history, always careful to avoid certain topics. Those who knew him well said he carried a sadness that never quite left his eyes, as if some burden weighed on him that he could never put down. The aftermath of Friesoythe changed how militaries around the world thought about combat stress and war crimes. After World War II ended, military justice systems began to recognize that soldiers pushed past their breaking point might not be fully responsible for their actions. The term battle exhaustion evolved into combat fatigue and eventually into post-traumatic stress disorder. Doctors and psychologists studied what happened to men in continuous combat. They learned that the human mind can only take so much horror before something breaks. The Geneva Conventions were revised in 1949, just 4 years after the war ended. The new rules tried to address the problems of irregular warfare and partisan fighters. They created clearer definitions of who was a legal combatant and who was not. They established stronger protections for prisoners of war and civilians. But even the new rules struggled with the reality that Frisoith had exposed. When one side ignores all rules completely, how do you enforce rules on the other side? When soldiers have been brutalized by months of combat against a merciless enemy, how do you expect them to show mercy? Modern militaries developed comprehensive mental health screening programs based partly on lessons learned from incidents like Frisoith. Soldiers are now rotated out of combat zones regularly to prevent the kind of continuous stress that the Argyll Regiment endured. Military psychologists are embedded with combat units to identify problems before they explode. Rules of engagement are written with much more detail about what to do in ambiguous situations. None of these changes can prevent all atrocities, but they represent an attempt to learn from the past. Canadian forces, in particular, became leaders in addressing the psychological costs of combat. The military created programs to help veterans deal with what they had seen and done in war. Counselors were trained to work with men and women carrying the burden of terrible memories. Support groups brought together people who had experienced similar traumas. It was not perfect, and many veterans still fell through the cracks, but it was a recognition that sending soldiers to war and then abandoning them afterward was morally wrong. The broader question that Frisoith raised has never been fully answered. Where is the line between justice and understanding? When do we hold people accountable for their actions, and when do we recognize that circumstances made those actions almost inevitable? The men who executed the SS Guards were not monsters. They were ordinary people pushed into extraordinary circumstances. They had been trained to kill the enemy. They had watched their friends die. They had been told that the SS were war criminals who deserved no mercy. And then, when their beloved commander was murdered by a sniper after the fighting was supposed to be over, something inside them snapped. Some historians argue that Vaux made the right choice. Prosecuting traumatized combat veterans for actions taken in the fog of war would have been cruel and pointless. The men had already been punished by their own consciences. Adding legal punishment would not bring back the dead or undo what had happened. It would only destroy more lives. Other historians insist that Vaux betrayed everything the Allies claimed to be fighting for. If there are no consequences for war crimes, then the rules of war become meaningless. The difference between a professional army and a gang of murderers is accountability. Perhaps both sides are right. Perhaps the real lesson of Frisoith is that war itself is the crime that makes all other crimes possible. We send young men and women into situations no human being should face. We expose them to horrors that break their minds and souls. We ask them to kill. Without becoming killers, to witness atrocities without losing their humanity. And when they inevitably fail at this impossible task, we are shocked and outraged. We demand accountability from people we have already destroyed. The 50 SS Guards who died in Frisoith were victims of war's ultimate crime, not murder, but war itself. And the Canadian soldiers who killed them were victims of the same crime. General Vaux understood this truth in his bones. He knew that sometimes being a good commander means protecting your men from the consequences of what we turn them into. History can judge whether he was right or wrong, but no one who was not there, who did not feel the weight of 10 months of continuous combat, who did not see friends die day after day, can ever fully understand the choice he faced or the decision he made.